Welcome to Clone Correct, a very special episode. The USGI M16A2 rifle.
All right, boys, we interrupt your regularly scheduled AK slideshow, which I haven't done in a while anyway because YouTube gave me a warning and I want to save the strikes for later to bring you something different. Today is the first episode of a new series called Clone Correct. In Clone Correct, we're going to delve into the world of military weapon cloning in torturous detail, with episode number 1 being the US military M16A2. Now, cloning in our context is the firearms subculture of replicating what is normally an unobtainable firearm. Oftentimes, the firearm is historical. Now, we're going to do that by doing a short history lesson, going into the major variants, as well as parts details and parts evolution themselves. I'm Rob Stott. I've been a gun history nerd since I was 8 years old when I started to read Ian Hogg and Jane's books at the library after watching G.I. Joe. I'm also a retired U.S. Army soldier where I spent all of my operational time as a radio operator pogue in special operations or airborne long-range reconnaissance units. So in between being chained up to my LST-5 Charlie in the corner of the talk, I was able to see a lot of this stuff firsthand. Now, I was a pogue, not a shooter. So while I did go out of the wire, did deploy, did cross-train, did do a couple other cool guy schools, it was only enough to make me dangerous. I haven't trained in 15 plus years anyway, so take anything that you see in my silly shooting montages with a grain of salt. Today I'm 10 years and 18 pounds in a DD214 and chill, and we're going to learn how to clone the US military M16A2. Now, much of my information comes from first-hand observation when I was in the Army, so other services may vary. The M16A2 is a gas-operated, magazine-fed rifle. It had the distinction of being the last general-issued rifle in U.S. military service. It entered production for U.S. military use in 1986, and during its heyday in the late 80s and early 90s, everyone from the 4'6" female in the 69th Postal Company to Chad Giga Chad in 5th Special Forces Group would get issued an M16A2 as a primary weapon. Now, ignoring units that rated Tier 1 weaponry, the M16A2 started to get superseded in 1995 when it was largely replaced by the M4/M4A1 or the M16A4, depending on the type of unit as well as the time frame. It still soldiers on today, although in rather limited numbers. Now, the generic configuration of the M16A2, or the official configuration, is as follows. You have an A2 flash hider, sometimes referred to as a compensator because it lacks slots on the bottom. You have a 20-inch 1-in-7 twist barrel that's often described as being heavy in the wrong location. You have a standard A2 front sight base, which is lower than the modern front sight base intended for flat top rifles. Now, they used to mark the flat top rifle front sight bases, but that's not as consistently done anymore, as is no longer a mil-spec requirement. You have the slim A2 clamshell handguards, although since the global war on terror, sometimes those have been replaced with the M5 RAS system. You have the proper M16A2 upper receiver, which has adjustable windage as well as adjustable elevation or bullet drop. You have the new M16A2 lower receiver, although as far as the military is concerned, the lower shape does not dictate the model type. You have the new M16A2 buttstock, which was longer than the old A1 buttstock. And then finally you have the new M16A2 pistol grip with finger groove. Now on to the part you've been waiting for, the slideshow with narration. Any turnkey clones? Yes! If you are a just as good or inspired kind of guy, then currently there are a few manufacturers making generic M16A2 clones. Springfield Armory, Harrington and Richardson, aka PSA, and others. I have seen the Springfield Army rifles in person at a big box store. Overall appearance, not bad. But they do seem overpriced for what they are, and they do use the modern laser engraving that everyone hates. In times past, Colt, the primary military contractor, made a variety of M16A2 clones. During the 1980s, Colt made the AR-15A2 government model. It does have the usual Colt problems of the time: an oddball slab side lower, large non-captive pivot pin. But it was made at the same time, at the same factory, using mostly the same parts as the contract rifles. Of course, these are collector's items today and priced accordingly. Just like your mom. In the early 90s, Colt made the Sporter Target. Some used the oddball lowers, while others had a better lower with magazine fence and standard pivot pin. But they lacked a bayonet lug. After the assault weapon ban in 1994, Colt moved to the match target line. Because of the assault weapon ban, they don't have a threaded muzzle or a bayonet lug. Today, however, they do make a great start to an M16A2 clone. Change out the barrel, and you're done. Finally, Colt did make the AR-15 target model in the late 90s for law enforcement. These had a proper lower with M16A2 upper that had a bayonet lug and flash hider. These were for law enforcement sales only, and because the trend at the time was more towards carbines, not many were made. Obviously, the assault weapon ban doesn't matter anymore, and you can buy the used law enforcement rifles. They are a great option if you can find one. They are virtually unknown, so they are still under the collector radar. I had the H-bar version at one time, and it was a nice rifle that I didn't pay a premium for. But if that doesn't do it for you, then you have to build it. M16A2 variants. For cloning purposes, I would argue that there are four major variants of the M16A2 that can be cloned. First is the Colt M16A2. Colt was the original primary contractor and had a piece of the contract from beginning to end. Second is FN, or Fabrique Nationale, a Belgian company. They were awarded a major contract to build the M249 SAW, and as such, built a US factory. They bid on and won a major M16A2 contract in the late 1980s and were the secondary manufacturer. Later, they also had the contract to build the M16A3. The earlier models of the M16A3 used a carry handle upper receiver, so for cloning purposes, they are very similar. The FN rifle's major differences, besides the forge codes and other markings, would be lower shape. Third would be U.S. Army rebuilds. During the late 80s and early 90s, Anniston Army Depot took some of the hundreds of thousands of M16A1 rifles in storage and rebuilt them into M16A2s. On the property book, as an M16A2, they used recycled M16A1 lower receivers with new M16A2 parts for the rest. A similar trend continues today, with older M16A2 rifles being updated with new parts. and even rebuilt into other things such as M4s and M4A1s. The fourth and final variant would be Air Force rebuilds. Though they pioneered the M16, small arms were never a priority. The few personnel that did need such a rifle, such as the SPs and persons that were attached to Army units, made do with a hodgepodge of stuff, often carbines. However, they did have fixed stock rifles in inventory, including even original Colt 601s, so they purchased kits to rebuild them into M16A2 configuration. I only mention these rifles because the parts to clone them accurately have surfaced in recent years. Plus, it gives you the excuse to use some of the new cool retro lowers on your build. Well, what parts go with what variant? Let's dive into that as well as the commercial alternatives. Starting from the buttstock, there isn't any major variation of the fixed buttstock. The modern commercial ones aren't the greatest in quality, but are close enough. Starting in 2008, the Army did authorize the purchase of a collapsible stock kit for use on the M16A2 and A4 rifles. It is a standard carbine stock system with the exception of an H6 buffer. If you are doing a clone, then a standard buffer will work, as remember, the reliability requirements that justify the H6 buffer were focused around burst fire and not semi-automatic mode. Not sure about the other services. The Marines did create a similar kit for their M16A4s, but I'm not sure if they still had M16A2s when that kit was created. Pistol grip. Here we have the standard Colt grip that was used until 1998, which would have been the entire production time of the A2. The FN grip is slightly different, but luckily most of them are marked inside with an F or with an E. And I'm sure that there's some oddball replacements in the system as well. The modern A2 grips that everyone makes are close enough to FN, but if you want a Colt, you have to spring for a Colt. The lower receiver will vary. One of the M16A2's improvements was a strengthened lower receiver. However, this is one of the few parts that will vary widely during USGI M16A2 production. Colt used this first type of forging during M16A2 production. It is different than all of the receivers made today. Commercially, some smaller manufacturers like SGW use them, as well as Colt for their Sporter line and Ban Era Match Target line. There are slight variations over the years with the magazine defense and so on, but nothing that you can really notice without comparing side by side. FN used another forging during M16A2 production. It is very similar to 95% of the commercial forged lowers sold in the United States. As of late 2024, FN has actually released a few batches of commercial semi-automatic lowers that are marked M16, and with very similar markings to the contract guns. The biggest detractor being they are marked auto and not burst. Ignoring that, the markings aren't 100% match for the military guns either, but it's certainly better than using something else. As mentioned earlier, Anniston Army Depot took old M16A1s and recycled them into M16A2s. The lowers were remarked as such. So, besides the Colt XM16E1s and M16A1s remarked and rebuilt as M16A2s, receivers from Harrington and Richardson and Hydromatic were used as well. The most common modern commercial A1 lowers available today are from Harrington and Richardson and are based on the old Nodak Spud forging. That forging has a major flaw regarding the shape, especially around the buffer tube area. It does not meet my standard, but it might meet yours. Chris Cox at International Milco makes a new A1 lower that is much closer, but still not perfect. He has even done a run of lowers that are roll marked Hydromatic and then re engraved to look like an Anniston Army Depot rebuild. However, in this case, That small scale and extra attention to detail means extra cost. The other source for an A1 lower is to find an old LMT made lower. LMT did not sell them directly, but did make them under variants for Eagle Arms, Bushmaster, and the most common Pac West arms. And I'm sure there's others that I missed. Infuriatingly, these are pre 94 pre band receivers and command a premium. SGW slash Olympic Arms also made some as well. Then finally, Sendra, although Sendra receivers sometimes have an oddball selector stop. Balamoy Manufacturing was one of those fly-by-night government contractors that made replacement parts. They made replacement receivers that were used by Anniston Army Depot and used the same type of forgings that Colt did. Now, for some reason, the Balamoy lowers were originally marked A1 despite being M16A2 pattern lowers. The U.S. Air Force was the pioneer of the M16 in U.S. military service and bought quantities of original Colt 601s, 602s, 604s, and then finally property of U.S. government marked M16s, which was simply the Colt 604. Sometimes these lowers were remarked with stamps or electric pencil, sometimes not. Commercial clones of these receivers have been made in recent years by Nodak Spud slash H&R, Brownells, and more recently by International Milco. Upper receivers. There is quite a bit of marking variations as the different manufacturers all use different and sometimes the same forging houses. The first uppers used by Colt used a CM forging code. For Colt, later rifles did use CMB. This changed over sometime in the early 90s towards the end of production. Colt did continue to make commercial and export M16A2 type upper receivers, but as best as I can tell, they were not used in USGI M16A2s. FN, the initial forging code primarily used during M16A2 production, was FK. Some of the other ones seen over the years are FM, FMB, F squared, and F with the stylized A. FN has also gotten a lot of spare parts contracts over the years, which would explain the variety of forge codes. As spare replacement parts, the Army did purchase loose spares from both Colt and FN. They also purchased from other companies as well. This EK marked upper is from EMCO, another one of those oddball companies. They made replacement uppers and barreled uppers. LK is another part that I have seen as a replacement part. These spare uppers were used to both repair damaged rifles, but also were used by Anniston Army Depot to do the M16A1 to A2 conversions. In the late 90s, Capco made replacement uppers, primarily as barreled receivers. These were intended to be used by the Air Force and others to finally convert old M16 type rifles into some sort of A2 configuration. The modern commercial uppers sold today can be a mixed bag. From photographs, the modern version with square forging mark is the closest cosmetically, ignoring, of course, the markings. Colt receivers are easy to find today, but do bring a premium. Most, however, are the later CMB marked and are normally takeoffs from commercial match target and sporter rifles. FN and other USGI contract receivers can be found as well, but again, for a premium. There are no major variations of the adjustable rear sight. Obviously, the commercial parts might not be the best quality in comparison to the 80s mil-spec parts. The port door is the same story. Forward assist, there are two primary types. The early version of the Colt M16A2 used the large D-shaped forward assist. Colt switched over to the standard type later in production. The standard forward assist was used by all the other contractors as well. The large D-shaped forward assist was available as a replacement part, so sometimes it will have found its way onto other rifles. It should be noted that Colt also made a large round forward assist that was made for the M16A1 rifle, and it will not clear the A2 receiver. The tapered delta ring was one of the M16A2 program improvements, though Colt had introduced it earlier on other models. There are no known design variations. The modern commercial versions, you just have to be careful as there are some cheap versions in plastic, while the mil-spec version is aluminum. Barrels. The M16A2 barrel design slash shape was the same regardless of manufacturer. Colt barrels are marked as such. FN. The early ones were actually marked FN, and others were marked with the cage code. Replacement barrels were also made by MCO, both loose as well as part of barreled uppers intended for rebuilding A1s. Some of these MCO barrels were bad as they were not chambered correctly, and so a lot of them had to be pulled. Capco made replacement barrels, primarily as part of their barreled receiver program. Finding a good USGI M16A2 barrel is difficult these days. Not much surplus out there. There are sometimes takeoffs from commercial Colts and a handful that fell off a truck, but that's it. Luckily, Wyndham Weaponry makes a nice clone. The only downside is it's not parkerized under the front sight base. Front sight base, no known design variation. These are 0.040 inches lower than the modern front sight base intended for flat tops. The markings on these are a can of worms that I don't have the answer to due to the scarcity of information. Sling loop, only one variation. Some units, like Lurse, would remove the sling loop for noise discipline. Handguards. There are two major variations of the plastic handguards. Early Colt handguards are glossy in appearance, although from personal experience, matte handguards will turn glossy when handled with hands covered in sweat and GI bug juice. Later handguards had a matte texture. The interior heat shields also have the do not remove markings, while the early versions did not. Commercially easy to find, but there are fat M4 style handguards, so be careful. Starting in the early 2000s, M5 RAS systems started to get installed as well. In this photo, we see both a complete M5 RAS on the left, while on the right, he is using the bottom rail from the M5 with a standard A2 upper handguard. Flash hider, only one variation, using the peel washer. The textbook answer was that it was supposed to be timed, but real world results will vary. The crush washer was introduced after the production run of the M16A2, but while the rifles were still in service, so it is plausible that these happened as well. The M16A2 was the last iron sight rifle, but optics did see use. And many of us are getting older and can't see the irons as well as we used to, so what optics are correct? Optic mounts to allow the use of commercial 1-inch and 30mm scopes have been around since the 60s. Naturally, dudes would take this and apply it to their issued weapon. This famous photo shows a Marine in Panama in 1989 with a commercial scope on his M16A2. Here's a similar image from Desert Storm showing similar setups in use. So really, anything in that realm could be clone plausible. Personally purchased Colt Type 3 and 4 power scopes have been used on the M16 series since the 1960s. This 1980s photo, straight out of the National Archives, showed that the tradition continued. Hako of Japan was Colt OEM manufacturer, and an assortment of 3 and 4 power scopes have been sold under the Colt name, under their own branding, as well as under other companies like Combat Military Optics. I remember lusting after the CMO scopes in the US CAV catalog in the mid 90s, but the top of the line model was in the ACOG price realm. A lot of money when you know where the $5 ATM machine is in Fayetteville. So it is plausible that a Geardo like myself bought one. Today, Colt type scopes from Colt, Hako, and CMO can be found on the secondary market. Brownells also imports 4-power Colt Mark scopes from Hako's successor in Japan. Cheap Chinese copies can be found as well. Colt also offered very similar 3 and 4 power scopes in collaboration with Seymour. This was done sometime in the late 90s. This image, supposedly taken in Somalia, shows, based on the fact that they're old and the overall gear, are Army SF. One of them is using a 4-power Hensoldt Blitz scope mounted to an arms number 2 mount. The Blitz was an updated version of the old G3 scope. Here we have a photo from the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003 with a conventional soldier using a Blitz scope on an arms number 5 riser mounted to an arms number 2 carry handle mount. Here we have a Marine from the early days of the GWAT using a US Optics SN12R 4-power fixed scope. The first 4-power ACOG, the TA-01, was introduced in 1987, but I've never come across a period image of one, as units that had money to buy them rated carbines anyway. But it is plausible. The early years of the GWAT changed all that. Both the Marines and the Army mounted TA-31 ACOGs to the carry handle. Both unit purchased and personally purchased. During those early years, it was the Wild West, so a lot of weird shit happened. Red dot sights didn't become widespread until the late 80s, early 90s. But like the ACOG, units that had money for red dots rated carbines anyway. The one exception, of course, was the 75th Ranger Regiment. This image from Somalia shows an M16A2 with an aim point 3000 or 5000 and with the aim point magnifier. The aim point comp series was adopted by Big Army in 1997 as the M68 CCO or Close Combat Optic. The first comp M's, M2s, and M4s all included a gooseneck mount to enable the use of the M68 on the M16A2 rifle. The ACOG Reflex. These were introduced in the mid 90s for commercial sale. A version of this was bought as part of the initial SOP-mod kit about the same time, but these didn't last long. I have never heard or seen photos of the issued version ever being mounted on M16A2s, as it didn't come with a mount. Having said that, the ACOG Reflex was turned in to DRMO about the same time that conventional Army was scrambling for optics during the early years of the GWAT, so anything is possible. This one is identical to one that I personally purchased in 1996 and rocked on my issued M16A2 for a couple of years. Since we already have the photos ready to go, and it kind of sort of fits, I'm going to discuss the ARMS number 2 carry handle mount. The ARMS number 2 was awarded an NSN in 1989. It was originally intended to mount night vision optics on the M16 rifle. Not sure how much use that saw, as in the olden days, the few night vision scopes that were floating around, like the PVS-4, were mounted on the crew-served weapons like the M60 and M249. Of course, the mount saw use for day optics as well. The early version used a Weaver profile rail. Later, this transitioned to a Stanag rail. I'm not sure when, as the Stanag rail was standardized in 1993, but Dick Swan, the designer of the Stanag rail, was the owner of ARMS. Some of the early mounts were marked with Colt trademarks and were a component of the Colt Delta H-bar rifle. In later years, the leftovers were sold off as loose parts. Naturally, the period collectibles command a premium. As long as I have been in the game, there have been cheap copies, sold under brands like Ultralux, US Tactical, and others. About 10 to 15 years ago, a batch of these knockoffs started to show up on eBay with Colt markings. I'm not sure if these were for the airsoft market or something else. but they weren't sold at a premium. In more recent years, unknowing or downright shady resellers have started to pass off these faux Colt mounts as originals for the same hundreds of dollars that the originals go for. They're easy to tell apart if you know what to look for. The knockoffs will not accept a scope with stand-egg feet like the G3 scopes, though, as they are out of spec. But if you are just after mounting scope rings, the knockoffs do the job. All right, dudes, welcome back. I'm glad that you made it this far. Now we're going to take a look at my clone. For this, I cloned my issued M16A2, which was a Colt, serial number 6213499. To build this rifle, what I did is I found a 90s era match target rifle that had the nice gray color anodization as well as the proper lower shape. Next, I swapped out the barrel for a Colt M16A2 barrel. Then I swapped out the Ford Assist to a large D-shaped Ford Assist, as my issued rifle had that, and that was one of the things that I remember the most about it. The furniture is a set of 1980s era Sporter II furniture, which I added to get that same overall feel that my issued rifle had. In 1996, when I was a 19-year-old gear queer, I took some of my hard-earned deployment money and I bought a Trijicon ACOG Reflex, just like this, an early model with no hood, to rock on my issued M16A2, with the eye that maybe later I'll put it on my personal AR-15. Now, as a commo guy, I didn't trust anything with batteries, and the cantilever mount of the ACOG Reflex allows you to co-witness. So I could zero and qual with iron sights, and then when it came time, I could slap this on, adjust the sights to co-witness, and be good to go. When it came time to turn it into the arms room, I could pull this off, throw it in my cargo pocket, and not have to worry about somebody ganking it when it was in the arms room. All right, dudes, well, thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and all that sort of stuff that I'm supposed to talk about now. And then join us next time when we learn how to properly clone everyone's favorite, the Colt 733 Commando. Till next time, dudes.